But first, Transport Minister Catherine King slammed for incompetency in Parliament today. The opposition grilling her over the decision she made to block international airline Qatar's bid for extra flights. The under siege minister left exposed as Prime Minister Anthony Albanese jetted off on yet another overseas trip. Opposition leader Peter Dutton demanded that Catherine King answer questions about who she'd met with at Qantas, how this decision was made, and who else in government she consulted with. Question time unravelled into a shouting match.
The circumstances could not be clearer, and the minister could not be more evasive. Mr Speaker, we need to hear from this minister in a very direct way whether or not she met with or spoke with Alan Joyce prior to making a decision to stop Qatar flying into our country, which was of commercial benefit to Mr Joyce and to Qantas.
The Labor government then accused the opposition of not wanting to take questions about its own decisions in relation to Qatar when Michael McCormack was the opposition Transport Minister.
What made them outraged, what suddenly enlivened them, was when the minister started to refer to what the situation was before the application was made. That's exactly what she was referring to. She was referring to what the situation the previous government had left in place.
Peter Dutton also accused the Prime Minister of misleading Parliament. Anthony Albanese stood up in Parliament late yesterday to clarify earlier comments he'd made about what he knew and what conversations he'd had about his own government's decision to block Qatar Airways' request for 28 more flights in and out of Australia. Well, Albanese returned to the chamber at 3:45 p.m. yesterday and said this.
I rise to add to an answer I gave earlier today. I spoke to the Virgin CEO on the 13th of July 2023 by phone from Perth while in transit to Canberra from the NATO summit and bilateral visit to Germany from the 9th July to 13th of July. In that call, the CEO made representations relating to air services arrangements with Qatar. During that discussion, I did not know that the Transport Minister had made a decision on the 10th of July 2023, a detail that has only been advised to me after question time today. I once again confirm I did not speak to the former Qantas CEO before a decision was made.
Right, so let's just unpack that. The Prime Minister had a conversation with the Virgin Chief Executive on July 13th about its international partner Qatar Airways' request for more flights. Virgin has said that those extra flights, that if they'd been allowed, it might have lowered prices by some 30%. In that conversation, my understanding is that Albanese did not tell the Virgin Chief Executive that a decision had already been made. Virgin, in that call, was lobbying for an outcome that was already off the table. And Virgin then didn't find out that a decision had been made until July 18th. But 3 days before the conversation between Albanese and Virgin on July 10th, the government had already decided to block Qatar's request. Let's just listen to Albanese saying that critical part again.
During that discussion, I did not know that the Transport Minister had made a decision on the 10th of July 2023, a detail that has only been advised to me after question time today.
Now, this timeline is critical. Albanese claims he didn't know about this decision 3 days after his minister made it. We're either not being told the full story here, or Albanese is not in control of his own government. Is this what we're being asked to believe here? That Catherine King made this decision on her own? Is this Albanese's suggestion in the Prime Minister's favourite portfolio? And the idea that the now departed Qantas CEO Alan Joyce, who had a hotline to the Prime Minister but never had any conversations with him about Qatar, well, this also suspends belief. Albanese insists he never spoke to Joyce or Qantas about this decision on Qatar Airways. And Joyce, for his part, says he won't speak about conversations that he's had with the Prime Minister.
Mr Joyce, in relation to the decision to grant the Prime Minister's son a Chairman's Lounge access, did you have any discussions with the Prime Minister regarding that decision?
Again, I'm not going to comment on Chairman's Club membership. I've got privacy issues.
Have you given any family members of any other politicians a similar free membership to the Chairman's Lounge?
Again, I will not comment on the Chairman's Lounge. I will not comment on who's in or who isn't in. There are privacy issues with that.
And in that Senate inquiry, he went on to say that he wouldn't comment on any conversations he'd had with the Prime Minister. They're all a private matter, he said. This all matters because we're in a cost of living crisis. Airfares are unaffordable for the average family, having risen by up to 50% since before the pandemic. We know Joyce and Albanese are self-described mates. They go way back to when Albanese was the Transport Minister and Joyce was at Qantas. Remember, this is the guy who, as we spoke about last night, caught a lift with Albanese on his private plane, Air Force Elbow, that the PM apparently calls Toto 1 after his dog, to the Jobs and Skills Summit in Canberra. Joyce also gave Albanese's son, as we just heard in that grab from the Senate inquiry, a membership to the exclusive Chairman's Lounge. And Joyce also gave a glowing praise of Albanese in a speech in June 2010. Joyce said, "Here in Australia, we have an ingrained understanding that a strong local aviation sector is essential to our national well-being. Minister Albanese made this very clear in the recent white paper and has been a genuine leader in promoting aviation excellence." Well, Alan Joyce's career as chief executive may be over, and that may be a circuit breaker for Qantas, although I don't think so. But it doesn't let Albanese off the hook. With each day that goes by, there are more questions for the government to answer over this scandal. That's why the inquiry into the Qatar decision that we broke the news of last night on air is so important. Joyce will be thinking he's in the clear from having to attend because he's no longer chief executive, but that's not the case. Sources tell me he could very well, and is likely to be, subpoenaed, and he'll be asked to give evidence about exactly who he spoke to in the government and who he lobbied. Qantas is hoping this scandal will now die down, but that's wishful thinking. Labor Senator Tony Sheldon is already demanding that unless Alan Joyce is stripped of his golden handshake, which is expected to be worth up to $24 million, then directors' heads should roll. This is what Tony Sheldon said on this program last night. Do you think he shouldn't be paid that $24 million? Are you asking for that payment not to go ahead?
That payment should absolutely not be going ahead, that $24 million for Alan Joyce. And Richard Goyder has responsibility, along with the board, to turn around and stop it. And if they don't, then board members' heads should roll. And I'll just add this, if they get 2 strikes out, then there'll be a spill of that board. And if any shareholder is worth any value, they'll make sure that they rectify this terrible, dismal event that's happening at Qantas.
So Alan Joyce has gone, but the problems remain. Here are the 6 main questions that the Qantas board and new CEO Vanessa Hudson need to answer. Number 1, on what basis are you giving Alan Joyce a bonus? Did Qantas and Alan Joyce know the ACCC was investigating before they let Joyce sell 2.5 million shares worth $17 million in June? And keep in mind, these shares would be worth $14 million if he sold them today, around $3 million less, partly because of this scandal of the ACCC investigation, which has now come to light. Did Qantas, did they sell the so-called ghost flights that were never going to happen? Why did they do this? Did they knowingly do this? Why won't Qantas refund flight credits owed to Australians instead of making people have to jump through hoops even now to get their own money back? What lobbying and contact did Qantas have with the Prime Minister and any other members of the government over the Qatar Airways decision? Exactly who did Qantas meet with and when? And when did Qantas give Anthony Albanese's son a Chairman's Lounge membership, and on what basis was this provided? Attention now also turns to Chairman Richard Goyder. This is the man who sought to shut down media reporting of matters that were firmly in the public interest rather than ask questions about the conduct. Questions he has a fiduciary duty to ask in his role as chairman. Pressure is mounting. The Fin Review journalist Joe Aston today writes that Qantas is only in this dire mess today precisely because Goyder has utterly failed to step up and do what needed to be done. He writes Goyder was re-elected at Qantas's annual meeting last year when very little of the company's appalling conduct had come to light. Yet he's now adamant that shareholders need him to stay and preside over the airline's brand turnaround. Now, out of all the scandals that are starting to plague the Albanese government at the moment, this is the biggest because it risks embroiling the Prime Minister personally. He has categorically stated in Parliament on multiple occasions that Qantas did not lobby him over the Qatar Airways move. As Joe Kelly writes in The Australian today, no clear answer has yet been given explaining why the Qatar Airways decision was taken, although several reasons have been suggested. The most consistent is the idea that Qatari application went against the national interest. The answer is unsatisfactory and the public should be given a clearer reason. Now the Prime Minister has revealed he was not involved. Greater scrutiny will also fall on Catherine King, who made the decision on July the 10th. She will be under pressure to reveal who she consulted both within and outside of government. And Peter Dutton and the opposition sought to find out these answers in Parliament in question time today, but the Parliament descended into a shouting match. Tony Burke insisted the Qatari decision was in the national interest, while Catherine King avoided giving clear and full answers.
The meetings I had with Qantas were in fact about the same job, same pay legislation because they had concerns about that. I stand by this is a decision I have made in the national interest. It is a decision that, in fact, when you reflect on what your government did when in government, is very consistent with the way in which this airline has been dealt with by previous governments over the history of this bilateral international air services agreement.